Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the 17th National Black Writers Post-Conference Program, a program that features our honoree, Percival Everett, and he will be in conversation with Ethelbert Miller. Our National Black Writers Conference, the 17th one, was held March the 20th through the 23rd. We had a large number of people. We had panel discussions. You will be able to see this online. We opened with a keynote with Michael Eric Dyson, and we had a featured conversation with Taya Miles. We had panel discussions. We had writers' workshops. We did a number of things over 5 days. We had an open mic. And our conference theme was All That We Carried, Where Do We Go From Here? That was taken from the book of Taya Miles, who wrote All That She Carried, the story of Ashley's sack. And that book is based on an enslaved woman who found out that her daughter was being sold. And so she gave her a sack. That sack made its own journey, and Taya Miles tells us this journey in her book. And so we decided to look at all that we carried and are carrying in these turbulent times, when we have voter suppression, when we have banned books, we have censorship of our curriculum, we have climate disaster, we have a rise in white supremacy, and we have a need to heal. And so all that we carried, where do we go from here, is a way of tracing the steps that we've had and looking at what we do to move forward. Our honoree was Percival Everett, and you're going to be hearing from him. We also honored Paul Coates, Bernice McFadden, and Peniel Joseph. So I'm very, very pleased to be able to have you share with us this special program. A special greeting to our honoree, Percival Everett, and also to Ethelbert Miller, a longtime colleague and friend, to our provost, Antoinette Coleman, to the National Black Writers Conference attendees who were there, to our writers, to the faculty and staff, to the community, the Medgar Evers community, and also to you for coming out and supporting this. And I just would like to acknowledge the visionary founder for the National Black Writers Conference, which was begun in 1986, the late John Oliver Killens, who had a vision to host a conference every year where you bring writers together to talk about the trends in the literature of Black writers and to have conversations and readings about their books. We are continuing the tradition of John Oliver Killens. Welcome, Percival Everett. Welcome, Ethelbert. And let's start our conversation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brenda. Well, Percival, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Ethelbert.
You know, the last time I interviewed you was back in 1983. You were a guest on my show, Maiden Voyage, on WUDC. The radio station doesn't exist anymore.
Well, luckily we still do.
We're still here, right? And that was in honor of your first book, Suitor. But I wanted tonight to begin our conversation by talking about three things: philosophy, painting, and the creative process. I was corresponding with the novelist Charles Johnson, and he mentioned that few American writers were writing the philosophical novel. By philosophical novel, he meant the novel of ideas, using Western or Eastern philosophy, exploring such questions as what is good, what is justice. Do you see yourself, Percival Everett, writing the philosophical novel?
I suppose, insofar as my work is initially motivated by questions of meaning, and construction of meaning, in particular, questions of logical identity. I think all art interrogates questions of ethics and morality and beauty. So in that way, I don't think I'm doing anything different from any other novelist. We're all doing philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Well, but if we look at your educational background, Percival, you obtained a 1973 bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Miami. You also studied philosophy at the University of Oregon. We're at a time in which people are like trying to phase out the humanities or say, okay, why do you should take philosophy? But when I look at your background, you are grounded in philosophy, and I wanted to ask you about why you decided to major in philosophy, and also who are some of the major philosophers that you were studying.
Well, initially, when I was studying philosophy, it was mathematical logic, um, and it went along with the science I was studying. Uh, Mathematical logic is not in any way math, but pure arithmetic is a part of it. And so, and when I was studying this, I of course read the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and um, and Wittgenstein wrote a book, the Tractatus Logicus, which is his idea that he had solved the problems of philosophy by creating a logical language. And he was wrong, and he refuted himself with a book called Philosophical Investigations, which led to the field of ordinary language philosophy. And I read that as I was leaving undergraduate school and continued to do philosophy of language in graduate school. Um, it turned out I hated philosophy. and well, and I shouldn't quite say that. I was very young when I went off to a PhD program, and maybe if I'd been a little more mature, I might have stayed with it. And sadly, I'd still be doing that now. Um, but uh, it occurred to me I'd always been a reader that writing fiction might be a better way for me to actually do philosophy.
Well, let's take the philosophy aspect here and look at your last novel, James. What philosophical question, what issues is James wrestling with? Well, are some of these issues shaped by race or class? What's going on philosophically? I mean, you have Voltaire appearing in a dream in the book, but what philosophical issues are being raised in this novel?
Well, John Locke and Voltaire appear in the novel James as stand-ins for Thomas Jefferson. These are the Enlightenment thinkers. Um, Jefferson didn't leave any philosophy to speak of um, in book form or text form, and so it was impossible for me to have James have access to Jefferson's philosophical thought other than the Declaration of Independence. Um, so I used other Enlightenment philosophers to address that. And the problem with the Enlightenment is, although there was a lot of talk about equality when it came to women and people with brown skin, that equality quickly fell away. Even Voltaire, um, whom we might actually like, um, uh, claimed that Black people, Africans, would be equal if they hadn't been so damaged by their geography
Mm,
and the effects of the sun. So it's uh, you can be equal, but you have to earn it.
mhm, right. Well, first of all, last Saturday, you had an art exhibit that opened up in where you are out in California. It was curated by Margaret Ross. The exhibition was called Redaction.
Yeah.
And the redaction, we know, is a process of censoring or obscuring part of a text for legal or security purposes. What is the difference between erasure and redaction?
Well, erasure, when something is erased, you don't see it at all. It's gone. It disappears. Uh, Redaction has in it this lie that as you cover up some of it, uh, you're protecting um, the truth or protecting someone by hiding what's actually true. So there's a technical difference there. And what's interesting, and one of the things I play on is that in English, redaction does mean to cover up, to hide, in order to protect. But in French, redaction means to put together,
Mm,
and so that's the play on language that employs itself in this show.
mm. In your book Erasure, which was made into the film American Fiction, you have a conversation between the artist William de Kooning and Robert Rauschenberg. Could you talk about that conversation and how it's key to the novel's title, which is Erasure?
I'm glad you asked me about that one because that's about the only thing I remember from that novel. Um, yes, Rauschenberg gave de Kooning a task. He said, "Make a drawing for me." And de Kooning went out and he used grease pencil and crayon and ink and made a drawing for Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg took that and erased it. He spent hours and hours rubbing it with erasers trying to get rid of it. And of course, he didn't. Um, but it was no longer recognizable. And in my novel, there's a conversation between Rauschenberg and de Kooning, and uh, de Kooning says, where's the painting, the drawing I made for you?" And Rauschenberg says, "Well, I erased it and I sold it." He said, "You sold my drawing?" "No, no, I erased your drawing. I sold my erasure."
Hmm. Now talk
Which,
about
you know,
how that plays in with the whole book, the novel.
well, it plays. It's a question of translation, um, and we can use the film American Fiction as an example. Um, uh, the Core Jefferson, the director, and the filmmaker, took my novel. He didn't erase anything, but he did redact things because you can't have an entire novel on screen, um, and so it becomes a new work of art. He
Hmm.
could easily say to me,
Right.
I didn't sell your novel. I sold your erasing. I sold my erasing." So it, we're always making work from other works.
Mhm. Well, first of all, I went back and read your short story, Big Picture, which is a title story of a collection published back in 1996 by Great Wolf Press. I saw the character Michael, who was a painter, to be Percival Everett. The story has a lot to do with ownership and protection of one's artwork. You know, where Michael's like breaks into the gallery to get his painting back.
Oh yeah.
And I wonder whether you see yourself facing the same issues as a character monk in the film American Fiction.
Uh, no, when I let work go, I really let it go. Um, um, I might not like how it's categorized, um, but the work has to do in the world what it's going to do. I refer to it as the Big Mama Bear School of Art, and that is, once I push it away from myself, it has to eat and survive.
Mhm.
And the one thing it can't do is come back to the den.
Mhm. So what I respect that, but did you have any input into the film, or were you like a consultant to the film, or did you just say, okay, I'll just let it go?
No, I was not a consultant. I put my trust in Cord, and it was well placed.
Mhm.
Um, and I liked the work very much. It's not my novel.
Right.
I recognize the story. It's a new work of art, as it should be, and that's
Mhm.
exciting to me.
Right. Well, your novels, Percival, are extremely funny when it comes to humor and satire. And I think of other African American writers like Ishmael Reed and Paul Beatty. But I find your novel, James, to be funny in the way the paintings of Robert Colescott are funny. You know, where, you have a take on Huckleberry Finn. Colescott has a painting of George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware as a remake of George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware. Do you see any connection between there? Because I saw a connection between your work and a painting, and I know that you like, we talked about your interest in
Mhm.
art, and I just felt that this type of work, Robert Colescott, is sort of like your book James.
Well, I'm flattered that you would think that. I can see the satire element present in there. I'm not replacing any figures with anyone else. Um, and James, I'm essentially granting a character who has been deprived his expression of agency that opportunity.
Hmm. Well, I was also wanted to ask you about humor. In your writing, are you drawing from African American folklore, or are you drawing from sayings and things that you witnessed growing up?
Well, both all the time. It's this stuff is ingrained in us. So it's not even something I have to think about. It's those things are present.
Hmm. You know, there was a thing in terms of when I look at how James is structured. Um, I was looking at how when you open that book, and I have it here, everybody talks about Mark Twain. Okay. Well, when I open this book, I ask myself, first of all, talk about Daniel Decatur's Emmett,
Mhm.
because it seems that this is that James steals his notebook, right? So when I open this book, what follows is actually maybe James writing
Yeah.
in the book.
Well, it's a book written by James, and this is the very book he's writing in. Um, and Emmett is credited with having written a number of songs, for that minstrel circuit of white people going around pretending to be black as a way of making fun of black people, um, and he's credited with writing Dixie, though it's likely he didn't.
Mm,
There are a lot of people who think that he did not write that, and it very likely is true that he stole that song because all of his other songs are really offensive
mhm,
in their portrayal of black people, the blue tail fly and things like that. Weirdly, um, as much as we black people dislike Dixie because it's an anthem for a certain mindset of the South, it's it could very well be an anthem for for Black Americans, having
mm,
uh, built the South and most of America, um, and 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 looking back toward it as something that has been built.
mhm. I was looking at how people were talking about your book and how they were reviewing it, what they were focusing on, a lot of emphasis on Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain. But then when I sat back and after finishing the book, I said, this is a love story, where you're talking about James, Sadie, and Elizabeth, this whole thing in terms of keeping one's family together. And there's also when I go back and I look at American fiction, there's like a love story in terms of this Black family. Talk about how important that is to your work, that theme not be overlooked.
Well, and James, uh, one of the disappointing things about the depiction of enslaved people in our culture is that, um, and it's in Huck Finn as well, is that slaves are presented as simple-minded, um, superstitious, uh, incapable of second order or complex thinking. Um, and of course, that's not true. They're human beings, um, uh, uh, complicated, complex, capable of duplicitous thinking, capable of complex thinking, capable of all the thinking that their masters um, would not attribute to them, but did all the time. Um, and 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 so in James, my mission is to show that enslaved people um, are complicated. They have agency. They don't have the opportunity and the luxury of expressing it, but they do far more than eat, sleep, hate, and love.
Mhm. Mm. I was thinking about when I was growing up in the South Bronx, and this gets into language. I could always tell when my mother was talking to a white person on the phone. She just had a
Mhm.
different tone. When is language nothing but a mask to slip on and off? We see that happening in terms of who James is talking to.
Well, enslaved, imprisoned, oppressed people are always going to find a way to talk to each other that does not allow entry of their enemies. I don't say oppressors because that implies victimhood, and I don't want to suggest that, even though obviously people were victims of slavery, they were not, in fact, victims. Um, they were they were the unfortunate. Let's call it that. Um, and and so taking language and making it private is something that humans do. They've always done it, they always will. And we even do it within families. We have ways of talking to each other that other people might not get. And sometimes it's inside jokes, sometimes it's a change in diction. It's subtle. In my novel, it's standard English that the slaves use when they're speaking to each other. Um, but who knows what it actually sounded like? In the novel, it just happens to be standard English. But when white people show up, it's to their benefit, to their safety, to their survival, to speak in a way that satisfies the expectations of their oppressors.
One thing I
So,
found, one thing I
no, go
found,
ahead.
one thing I found very early, actually in the very couple of pages of James, was this whole thing about naming,
Mhm.
and you do the whole thing from Jim to James. But then what I really thought was very, very profound. There's a slave that's named Doris, who's a male. So it doesn't matter, like, if this could be a name, it didn't matter whether it was male or female. I
Mhm.
thought that was so, it was just very profound. Well, we just give a name. It doesn't matter if it's male, it's just Doris. And I'm laughing at that, but I'm assuming that, that probably was done.
Oh, of course it was. That's why people had names like January and April.
Right. Yeah. Well, the other thing I wanted to ask you, and this is something that many times people will pick up a book and just skip over it, but I think it is important. Your novel, James, is dedicated to your wife, Dancy,
Yes,
who's also a well-known writer. And I was wondering, do you discuss your work during the process of writing, or do you wait until the book is finished?
I'm very solitary in the work. The first person who sees my work is my agent. Um, I've never shared work during the process.
Mhm. Sometimes, there's things that, happens to you or things that you read years ago go by and then you come back to it. And I was wondering whether that has ever happened.
Oh, sure.
Mhm,
Um, I have a novel, and all of a sudden there was an equation in it. It's my novel Zulus, and I wrote the equation, and I had no idea what it was, where it came from. So I started searching all my books, looking for this equation because I just couldn't leave it in, not knowing what it was. It made perfect sense in the novel when I found out what it was. An equation from ecology about population dispersal. Why I remembered it, I have no idea, but it came out.
mhm. The last question I want to ask you, Percival, is one that I've been asking a number of authors, and you are a good example of it. When we look at erasure or even the big picture, um, those have a Washington, D.C. setting.
Mhm.
Okay. You have been an individual that has lived in different parts of the country, going to school up at Brown, or going to school up in Oregon, being out west. How has geography or a landscape influenced your writing?
Oh, well, what's interesting is often it's after I've lived someplace that it will come back. I lived in Wyoming many years ago, and then when my wife and I were living in France, um, I wrote an entire book of stories set in Wyoming. It wasn't until we had come home from Paris for several years that I wrote something set in Paris. I love places. It's hard. I do not write about places I have not been,
Mhm,
and that makes it difficult sometimes.
mhm. Is there anything that you would like to ask me before we take questions from the? In fact,
Well,
one thing I don't know, I have not read. You write poetry. I have not read any Percival Everett poems.
well, that's because they suck. I'm not a I'm not a poet. One day I will stumble onto a good poem, and I keep trying. But this is you know, uh, I work at it.
Okay, all right. Well, we're going to take some questions from our audience, and first of all, it's always interesting to talk to you. And there's so many books that you've written, God's Country, others that are just books that you go back to, and I look at how I started out with Suter, because it's about baseball, and that just brought me into your work, and I'm just very grateful that I had that opportunity to read your first book and try to keep up, you know.
No, well, I'm just flattered that you read anything of mine. Thank you.
Okay, well, we're gonna take some questions and back to Brenda.
Okay.
How long were you in Washington D.C.? I mean, I remember meeting you, like in here, but how long were you, and what brought you to D.C.?
Well, I used to spend some time in DC growing up, and then and I had a connection with DC with Highland Beach in
Mhm.
Maryland, and so I guess actually lived in DC for maybe 2 years.
Right, right. And then the other thing that I was curious about, which I think comes with many writers, your books have been published by a number of different publishing companies. Okay. And I was wondering in terms of one, do you match up a book with the company, or do people come to you, or you at a point where anything you put out there, somebody will say, okay, it's a Percival Everett book, I'll publish it.
Well, I was at Gray Wolf Press with my fiction for 29 years.
Right.
So I didn't move around at all with fiction, um, and with the same editor. I was with
Hmm.
a woman named Fiona McCrae, who was
Right.
and Fiona retired. And had she not retired, I very likely would still be with Gray Wolf.
Oh, okay.
Um, and the poetry has been published pretty regularly by Red Hen Press here
Hmm.
in Los Angeles, and they've been very kind to me. And I like I've always liked smaller houses, um, and I love being at Gray Wolf because they would excuse me, they would allow me to pretty much write what I wanted to write.
Hmm.
And it was the case that I knew if I wrote, I write some very strange things, and if I gave them a book, they would take it. There's a lot of artistic freedom, um, that that kind of artistic freedom allows me to make a certain kind of work.
Mm. Well, I was wondering in terms of, it seems like you built up a relationship with a particular, editor. It's just a trust factor. How does that occur when you say, okay, first of all, I like this, but let's do some revision? Or is that trust factor there where you say, okay, because you said in even this conversation, it seems like once you do something, that's it, and you're moving forward. You're not
Oh
going
no,
back.
that's when the work is complete. The work's not complete when I just stop writing the third or fourth draft. Um, I'm I've always worked with my editor to make the book the best book it can be. I take the help I can get. I'm just, uh, I don't know how profitable it is for anyone to give books to people who are close to them
Right.
for consult. I know my children, and no matter what they draw, I love it. And so that's not helpful to them.
Right. When I began the questions to you this evening, I started out with a painting. The one person I was thinking about in terms of like sort of like yourself, who also is a novelist and painter, was Clarence Major.
Oh yes.
And I thought about that because, when I got into Clarence Major's work, it was like reflex and bone structure. He was doing very much experimental work. And I asked, you about the philosophical novel, and I don't want to put labels on you, but do you also at times see your work as being experimental?
I think all novels are experimental. All literary novels are, because we don't know what we're doing when we start them. You know, a lot of genre work has their formulae. A romance novel is going to look like a romance novel. Of
Mhm.
course, there are going to be novels that push the boundaries. Ursula Le Guin gets called science fiction,
Right.
but her work's not like most science fiction.
Mhm.
But most science fiction hits all the right notes, and they do a certain thing. Um,
Some of our writers have a tendency of stretching out, and I was wondering, have you thought about, writing like a memoir or even doing
no,
any
I believe in the power of fiction.
nonfiction?
Uh, and when I'm 99 and I've done enough, then I can write a memoir. But I really have no interest in reading the memoir of somebody who's 30 years old.
I'm saying I'm listening to you there first. I've written two, so I'll take that as criticism. I think Brenda has joined. Brenda, are you there?
I see your name
Yes,
there.
Yeah,
I'm
there we go.
sorry. I had some
Okay.
technical problems.
Okay.
Sorry
Yeah.
about that.
No, no
I
worries.
thought we would invite some of our participants, people who've been listening, to ask some questions. And first of all, I've really enjoyed some of the comments that you've said. Been very helpful for me, better understanding your work. And what I tried to do, as I mentioned in the beginning, is to talk about philosophy, painting, and things that I felt are key to understanding what you produce.
Well, thanks for the questions. They're great.
Okay, so do we have you put your questions in the Q&A? And so this is an anonymous. Hello, Percival. James is an awesome story. Your novels, while satirical, have serious messages. What would you like readers to take away from your writing?
I if someone is reading and thinking that's all, that satisfies me. You know, one doesn't. You know, I try to make fiction to make a living, and that's ample evidence that I'm mentally deficient. So you don't come to a novelist for advice and a message. You come to a novelist for art, and then the reader makes the meaning and makes what's important. Um, the work doesn't exist until the reader comes to it and constructs that meaning. And it's going to be different for every reader. Reading is the most subversive thing we can do. No one can see what goes into you and what you bring to a text to create the meaning you need. That's why literacy is so important. That's why books scare the right wing and fascist regimes so much.
Right. I just have a follow-up question to that, because you teach writing. Of course, you're teaching creative writing. What do you say to your students about writing and the relationship of the reader to the writer, or the writer to the reader?
Well, you can imagine an ideal reader, I suppose, and that usually has to be oneself. Uh, but if you're trying to write, unless you are making genre work, um, if you're trying to write for an audience, there is no one audience. I can't write 200,000 different novels. I can write one novel, and hopefully 200,000 people will eventually get to it, and they will make that many different meanings. Um, uh, I'm not important in this equation. I make the work, but I don't make it the meaning.
So just again, following up with the writer being, as people are writing, they're writing about the other. How do you get your students to understand or to write from the perspective of the other?
Well, they have to write from their perspective, um,
Okay.
and they're you know, one of the failures of our language is that it has allowed the entry of talking about the experience of the other as if it is one thing.
Okay. Thank you. What books and authors do you often recommend?
Well, that's that. There's everything. I know. I love Chester Himes, Zora Neale Hurston, Mark Twain. Um, my favorite novel is Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern. 1741 is the most postmodern text you will ever see. Um, uh, there's just so much work to read.
You're writing across many genres and in conversations with many writers. So just going back to James, Donna Hill, who's also a faculty member here at Medgar Evers College, as you talk a bit more about the genesis for James. Ethelbert sort of touched on it, has to touch on it, but if you can talk about the genesis for writing James.
Well, I wish I had a great romantic answer for that. As if for years I'd been wanting to do this, and finally it hit me. But no, just 3 years ago, I was playing tennis and I hit the ball wildly out of the court. As I watched the ball sail, I thought to myself, has anyone ever told this story from Jim's point of view? Which explained to me why I had hit the ball so poorly. Um, but I went home and I looked, and no one had. And I wondered, why hadn't anyone done this? And then I remembered I hadn't thought of it either. Um, And so I just went and did it. And then the book, writing the book, explained to me why I was writing the book.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, it started as wanting to. My thinking was I would be giving agency to Jim, and then I realized that Jim he already had agency. What I was doing was addressing his lack of an opportunity to express his agency in that story. Also, I was addressing the depiction of the slave's mind in that story. And I was also addressing something that I didn't like in a film called 12 Years a Slave. And
Oh, okay.
in 12 Years a Slave, um, we have a free black man who's grown up in this strangely and weirdly idyllic Vermont with his chummy white neighbors, and he's kidnapped and taken into slavery. And he's thrown in with enslaved people, and immediately he understands what they are saying, and that's not possible. He was not enculturated with them. He was not trained by them. Um, and so he would be just as clueless as all the white people when they're speaking to each other. And that cheated the enslaved people out of an important part of their humanity. And that's what bugged me about that film. And so I was addressing that failure.
Very interesting concept. I'm going to follow that up with a question from Sonia Adams, who asks, do you see advances being made in the publication and reception of Black literature? And of course, erasure is much about also about the publishing field. But you, in writing James, was talking about how you were writing in response to something you saw that was not realistic and authentic. So what are your thoughts on the publication, the publishing industry and the kinds of texts that are being published?
When I wrote Erasure 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, things were different. Um, and when it was published, probably not as dire as it was when I was a kid, and the stage was set for my thinking about the issues of the novel Erasure. Um, First of all, the novel isn't indicting any particular text as being incorrect. What I was indicting was the publishing industry's desire to have only one text represent that mythical creature called the African American experience. As soon as you enter into that language, then you're looking for a singular thing, and that's a problem. Now we have a great number of really fine writers of color, um, and the range of experience in those novels and stories is much greater. So in that way, the same thing is not true. That may be true in some insidious, quiet way that's hard to pinpoint, but that particular problem is pretty much been solved. I would that it persists in another kind of way, and that is about expectations. Um, uh, for example, I have a friend who's a film director, and and she had some success with a movie, and then which was had nothing to do. It was a drama. First call she got was, would she make a biopic of George Floyd? Uh, That's not what she had made. She didn't make a biopic of anyone, but she was approached for one reason. She was a Black director. Those kinds of assumptions and expectations of artists are really unfair. There is no reason to profile her in that way and think that this is where she should be. And, it'd be one thing if she saw this as a project and went after it, but it's another thing when a white film industry decides, oh, this is how we should use this talent.
First of all, I want to ask you a question about, and you see this in American fiction, it's also in literature, the judging of
Excuse me,
awards.
can you speak a little bit louder, Ethelbert? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the judging of contests, and I'm assuming that you have probably sat on some panels and stuff. I've always found that sometimes what happens is certain work that just doesn't have the vote. You know, it's good work, but you can't get an agreement. And so all of a sudden, a book wins, but that was not really the book that might have been the best book at that particular time. But talk about some of the dynamics that takes place within some of these contests.
Well, first of all, invidious comparisons of works of art is ridiculous. Awards are great only because they might help some artists and they might bring some attention to a work, but they're meaningless. Um, you don't get anything cutting edge in a committee. Um, it's like a writer's workshop. I tell my students, don't listen, listen, but don't listen.
Mm.
Art's not made by committee. 13 different voices in your head are not going to help you. Likewise, 5 different judges very seldom are going to come up with something that challenge the culture. There's going to be something safe. Um, so the dynamics are going to change with every panel because people are different. But in general, the works are going to be the product of compromise.
Well,
I just,
the reason I say that is because I used the NEA, for example, a number of years ago, where there would be an effort to try to get, you know, diverse representation, gender, race, class, everything, geographical regions. But then at the end of the day, everybody had the same view about literature. So
Yeah.
if somebody was doing something outside, they didn't get the vote, so they wouldn't get a fellowship.
Well, all you can do is allow all the work into the room for consideration,
Hmm.
and to have as much work represented there. Um, just showing up doesn't mean that it's going to be good enough, and even good enough is again, it's a committee.
Right.
Um, um, and if it's Thursday rather than Monday, the decision might be different.
right. Yeah, I was just going to follow up, Ethelbert. I'm glad you raised that point about the publishing, because we had a panel on publishing at the National Black Writers Conference. And one of the themes that really came out is the fact that you still do have a number of Black writers who are not being published because there still is a perception that the public only wants certain kinds of books. Of course, we had the rise in the number of Black writers who were being solicited and publishing as a result of Black Lives Matter. And so it goes with the tie. And it goes to who is determining what books should be published. That is still an issue. They talked about we had people from the major houses and talked about how they get so many books and it's so challenging to make a decision as to who to publish. And so there are consortiums and groups of collectives that are forming with other Black writers about looking at other ways to expand the audience. I think that issue, I think one of the reasons American fiction was really so good is because people could relate to it, particularly writers, those in the publishing field.
I agree.
Yeah. Just say, so you have another question. I have another question. This goes back to what I loved, Thelonious Monk Ellison. How closely did you relate to the character Thelonious Monk Ellison in American fiction? And naming him Thelonious Monk, I think that was brilliant.
Um, well, I mean, the character is alarmingly similar to me, so but it is not me. Hasten to point out. Um, no, his experiences with publishing are my own, and there's some. I drew a lot on my family. It's not an autobiographical novel, but that stuff is very central to me.
We have another question about James. You say in your acknowledgement that you look forward to a long-awaited lunch with Mark Twain in hell. What would you hope to say to him and discuss?
I don't know if we'd say much. We might just sit there and watch the river go by. Uh, um, that of course is a reference to his quip, uh, "Heaven for the climate, hell for the company." And so I might be too busy talking to Jimi Hendrix to actually sit down with Mark Twain.
Right. So this is how has presenting social commentary with a bit of humor been an effective way to reach people? So you have a lot of satire. Have to say, when I was reading the book that I kept laughing aloud at, and it takes a lot for me to laugh aloud while I'm reading, was I Am Not Sidney Poitier.
No,
Every time I think of it. So you have a lot. So presenting social commentary, which is what you're doing with a bit of humor, has that been effective in your view, a way to reach people?
I can't know. I hope so. Perhaps one of the best practitioners of that is not me or Mark Twain, but probably Richard Pryor.
Mhm.
Whose comedic work was always social commentary. You also find it with George Carlin. Um, I'm pathologically ironic, so when I start addressing uh, human beings, it usually starts to become absurd and probably funny.
Mm.
I don't set out to write comedy; it just happens.
You know, first of all, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you. When we talk about sports figures, musicians, they send the times. If you were born like with when Cassius Clay was coming up after school, everybody be jumping around, weaving and stuff like that. And I was wondering in terms of comedians, like I remember my parents were like Red Fox people, Mom's
Hmm.
Mabley. And
Sure.
then, well, you look up, it's like Dave Chappelle now, which is a little different from Chris Rock. And so, and I remember I was just watching this, preparing for this interview with you, it was Richard Pryor on the show with Johnny Carson. And so Johnny Carson said, "What should I call you? Should I call you Rick?" And he says, "Richard," just like he's out of your book. But so I was just wondering, were there certain when you were coming of age, were there certain comedians that you just said, "Well, so and so is just really funny," I really got into Chris Rock,
Hmm.
because it was just a way of just saying something that somebody would say, "Oh, he didn't say that."
Well, when we were little kids, of course, it was Bill Cosby,
Hmm.
um, because there was, it was supposedly clean humor. Um, and then as a teenager, it was Richard Pryor. That was, and of course there were more popular uh, comedians, but there was a little different. My responsibility was it Flip Wilson.
Flip Wilson,
It
right?
was a very funny guy, but it wasn't moving. It wasn't ironic, and there was no commentary in it. It was just funny.
Mm.
Um, but when you get to people like, yeah, well, before Pryor, Dick Gregory,
Right.
you know, and you mentioned Mums Mabley, who
Mhm.
was perhaps one of the most underrated social critics in comedy. She was really smart and she was
Mhm.
really funny, but she doesn't get a lot of
Right.
attention.
Yeah, I always
Okay.
found Marv maybe a lot more funny than Whoopi Goldberg, but that's that's just me.
This is a question from one of our longtime volunteers at the center, Stamili Mapp, and she's referencing Morrison. She says, "I think Morrison is another author who speaks to the multiplicity of agencies among enslaved people. And she also forces the writer to make a kind of sense of the story as she writes." Your thoughts?
Morrison is great. I mean, uh, the complexity of characters presented in something like um, Bluest Eye, or the one the novel I like so much is Song of Solomon. Uh, the characters are so richly rendered, and they have so much going on. Um, Beloved is 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 great, and so yes, I would agree with
Mhm.
that.
Well, first, I want to ask you a question about specific. I don't giving away the book, but when you get to the end of the book, James, who's seeking shelter, witnesses a rape. Um, and when I saw that, I said, how difficult is that to write about? And then we'll find later on that rage that is kept within inside James comes out at the end. But sometimes you're writing things in terms of, do you step away from the page in terms, okay, did I get this right? Or you just troubled by what you're writing?
Oh, always. But you have to write things that scare you. If if you don't feel like you're out on a limb sawing on the wrong side, then you probably haven't started working yet.
And this comes
Mm,
back to my question about when I began the discussion about the philosophical novel, because James has to make a decision. If he intervenes, well, that's going to risk everybody. So this whole thing of what do I do? What can I do? This helplessness. But then at the end, he's able in another situation to make a decision. You know, but I felt that was something where if you're teaching a class, you have to stop at that, and that's a discussion right there.
Well, that's yeah, I'm sure that any of us who have taught literature to young people have come upon scenes where they would
Right.
say, "Well, I wouldn't have let anyone treat me like that." And you say, "Well," and you construct a story for them. Imagine that somebody is treating you like that, and your wife and child are on the street with you,
Mhm.
and you live in a community where they lynch people. Do you risk having your wife and child be left alone? Do you risk your own life for your own pride, knowing that that will put other people at risk? Um, it's it's not just about how much testosterone a man has. It's about wisdom and not being helpless, but
Mhm.
being prudent.
Right. Brenda.
I think she's having technical
Oh,
difficulties.
difficult.
She's not moving.
It's not moving. Okay. We're moving. But I went back to that part, and I just felt it was very, very retching in terms of that. But I also how you resolved it, that many of us later on are filled with a certain rage, that has to find a way of getting out. Um, but then the other thing that doesn't be discussed is talking about Jane's relationship to Huck, and that relationship, which is like a father son relationship.
Well, yeah, in Huck Finn, the only positive male role model is Jim, despite his simplicity. Um, and the beauty of Huck Finn, and people talk, it's not the depiction of Jim at all. There's a failing there in the text, but it's Huck is an adolescent America wandering through his own landscape, trying to come to terms with that thing that becomes the most defining feature of the American experience, which is race.
Mhm.
Um, he's trying to figure it out. He's trying to reconcile the fact that his friend is property with the fact that his friend